Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Odd Stuff podcast. Today we have on Jeff Anderson and Jordan Jenison, and we go through and talk about the Nephilim in the Bible, a little bit about Genesis 6, and have a really fun conversation about where we're at in the world today with the Nephilim, and we get into a little bit of the cryptid stuff, but it's a very fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. We're at the Odd Stuff podcast, and we're going to talk about the Nephilim. And I have Mr. Jeff Anderson and Mr. Jordan Jenison with us today, and we're going to get into some really neat stuff about the Nephilim. So, Jeff, go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, if you would.
Yeah, cool. So, Jeff Anderson, been a college professor and a high school counselor and teacher, and still am a coach, still coaching baseball.
Awesome.
But have been a lifelong pursuer of the Bible and all that too. So when you say Nephilim, that's definitely a Bible term. That's right. Cool.
Awesome.
JJ.
Yeah, so I am in my 15th year of teaching, and fortunately been gifted with the ability to have a public school class titled Bible as Literature. And thanks to, all the close people in my life, I've been able to kind of open up the Bible in new ways in the last 10, 12 years, just to, as opposed to maybe the more orthodox reformed way of looking at, these pages and this library of text, been able to kind of look in between the gaps a little bit more, turn over some rocks and realize, there's a lot more than meets the eye. And so now I have this cool opportunity to kind of expose young adults to that, as well as most of the kids who take my class are kind of just, I call them Creaster Christians. They come on Easter, they come on Christmas, but besides that, they don't know much about this book that they, are claiming to have based their entire religion off of. And so it's really fun to get them to open up their eyes to maybe some of the more fascinating things, such as Nephilim. And I feel like at the beginning of the year, the Nephilim are the thing that grabs their attention more than anything. It keeps them, paying attention as we get through perhaps the tougher stuff in Genesis. But right out of the gates, it seems like, we got some really cool stories that keeps even our modern day seniors entertained. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Teaching that class, that's a cool class, and I subbed it a couple of times. And but the students in there, you kind of get the sense that when they're talking about the Bible, it's, they kind of be like, oh, it's the same old thing. We're learning about God, we're learning about Jesus and whatever. But when you bring up all this, the fantastic stuff, the creatures that are in there that the Bible actually talks about, they kind of go, they look at you and they go, oh, what? That's actually in there? You're like, yeah, have you ever read it? It's right there for you. So when you talk about you're getting into the Bible, right? Where we come up with the Nephilim or the sons of renown is mentioned in Genesis 6. And when we read that stuff, it's kind of like, if you're a Christian, you're Catholic, whatever you are, you believe in the Bible. So that means we have to believe in the Bible and what it says. We can't just take pieces from it, right? And say, okay, that's true. And I don't think that's true. We can't say that, right, as Christians. So when we're reading through this book, it's mostly about interpretation, how you're interpreting what you're reading, how I'm interpreting what I'm reading. What I really want to do is get into your guys' interpretation of what you're reading and what Nephilim means to you. And before we get started, I do have a question for both of you. We'll start off with Jeff. Jeff, what do you think about Bigfoot and Sasquatch?
Yeah. So, it does come down to just logical argument. And I think that just where there's enough smoke, there's fire, And I think that when you talk about things that are potentially true or potentially not true, you need to understand belief is not an on-off switch. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the first things that when you get into higher education, they're talking about rhetoric and you taking classes in logic and stuff. one of the things that they really will stress that you understand is that belief is a scale. It's not an on-off switch. It's not binary, and that, and however big you make that scale is kind of how you choose to define your belief. And, if we just do a 0 through 10, most of the things that we talk about like this, it's better to have the conversation centered on a belief scale as opposed to an on-off switch. Does that make sense? Kind of?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Using that as a scale.
Right.
So
So there's things like I think there's enough smoke with Bigfoot or Sasquatch or cryptids in general. And we can talk about that. I mean, I think, there's a scale of those large hominid, bipedal. They might have a face that looks more like a dog, or they might have one that looks more like a human. And I don't know that those aren't the same things, I mean, look at how many different species of actual dog there is. I mean, from Chihuahuas to my husky who's laying right here.
absolutely.
They can both have sex, you can breed them. So they're both dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a lot broader view of what is a human too in the Old Testament.
Right.
There is, I think that there were potentially, and again, this is that belief scale thing. It might be a 4 on your belief scale, or it might be up to a 6 or 7, that there are different types of human that were before the big Noahic flood. I think that was part of the reasons for the flood, was to get us back to Homo sapiens sapien. But I think before that, including the fossil record, there were different things that humans could have sex with, that could breed with, not just have sex with, but breed with. And that's where you get into the Nephilim. That kind of makes sense?
Absolutely. Sounds great. Jordan, what's your take on Bigfoot, Sasquatch?
Yeah, I'm very similar at that regard, where everything's a spectrum, but I just don't like how people like to not allow a card to be put on the table. Like, a card should be able to be put on the table, especially if you're someone reading the Bible with you're going to hear us say a lot of the unseen realm. Like, there's just so much to the unseen realm that has enough logical substance to it to have a conversation. And so I don't ever like when people, are taking something as smoky or as, anecdotally sound as Bigfoot sightings or Sasquatch sightings and just throw them out, because it's like, well, just because you don't have, scientific evidence to describe, and what is science now in the last 100 years anyway?
We could talk, that's a whole episode too, just talking about scientism.
Absolutely.
Now it's become a religion.
Absolutely.
A lot of these people are scientistic. I don't know that that's the same thing as what science is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like the saying too, you guys are saying there's so much evidence out there, so many stories out there, but if one of those is true, then that means it's real, right?
It breaks the paradigm, right?
Right. It's the same thing what happened with all the UFO stuff. People were saying, oh, I saw this, I saw that. And then all of a sudden, the government's like, yeah, we don't know. We don't own them. Nobody does. We don't know what those are. Right. But for the longest time, all they did was ridicule everybody about that. And it started all back in Roswell, when all that stuff started happening, and if you said you saw it, or you said you saw aliens, whatever you saw, you were ridiculed for it. And that's what kept going and washing it away. And they keep trying to do it with the Bigfoot. And it's just, there's more people coming out, every single day, and people having experiences. And some people spend their life in the woods and don't come across anything.
Right.
Nothing ever happens to them. Or you'll have one person the first time out there, they're terrorized, or they saw something they can't explain, I know. And so the thing that we could kind of relate to with Nephilim and Bigfoot, we can kind of say, are they the same thing, or one the same, or are they different? There's different takes on it, and what if a Bigfoot's a part of the fallen that came down, the big war that they had in heaven? A third of the angels fell. So that means that seraphim, cherubims, all those different sections of angels, they all fell, right? The 9 choirs of angels. And a third of heaven, we don't know what they could have looked like, So, I mean, there's a whole spectrum and thought of it.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to think of it. Is I don't think we're going to have definitive proof of a lot of this stuff this side of heaven. I think it's always going to be mysterious. And we could talk about why we think that might be true. So really, like Jordan pointed out, these are just cards on a conversational table. And even among, and it's really among Christian theologians, that these are still cards on their table. A lot of people in Jordan's class go to churches that they never talk about this stuff. And I'm totally okay with that, because you know what? A guy that's speaking every Sunday, trying to run a small to medium to large church, they're worried about the air conditioning and how comfy the seats are for the ladies and the men.
Absolutely.
They don't got time. And I don't know that that's the right format to bring up a lot of these subjects from a Sunday morning pulpit.
Right.
But I'm telling you, in the academic biblical realms, they talk about this stuff a lot. And there's lots and lots of peer-reviewed, documents discussing the stuff that we're talking about that you will never hear if your sum total of the Bible is hearing a guy talk from a pulpit every other Sunday or on Christmas and Easter, like he's talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, but do you think that that's part of that is because people they're either not open-minded to accept that, or it just scares the crap out of them?
Yeah, the answer to that question is yes.
It's all of the above.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it freaks out pastors. I just, because I know I have several pastors in my family. I have a nephew who's a senior pastor. I have a brother-in-law who's been a senior pastor for 40 years. And, and there's no way they would talk about this stuff from their pulpit.
Right.
Because it would freak people out. And honestly, they got better things to talk about from the pulpit. I mean, there's, homelessness and, and then, pursuing God and, but that doesn't mean this stuff isn't legitimate conversation. That's why you've got to expand your understanding of the Bible beyond just some dude or woman talking from a pulpit every Sunday or every once a, that makes sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think there are a lot of men who pick up the Bible and it's just like that. This isn't for me because I just can't read it. I'm not interested in it. And I just feel like the unseen conversation is the catalyst to get so much vaster of an audience engaged in this conversation. And I'll have conversations with people all the time about the reformed story of Jesus, and they check out, my buddies do, who are, super just like, well, a priest or Christian. But as soon as I bring up things related to the unseen realm, I've got them, and I'm just like, hey,
100%.
This could be God's way of just hooking in men, because men, we love story, right? And I think all humans love story.
Correct.
I mean, that's I think the connecting factor of all of creation is that we live a story. We have a beginning, we have a middle, we have an end. And therefore our brains, when we listen to narrative and story, both sides are working, right? It's not just right, it's not just left. We have emotion, we have logic, and it's all coming together. And so when you hear a story of Bigfoot, how are you not just like, I identify with that because I want to know what happened there, how this, was seen and how it's proven. And so we just are attracted to story. And that's what attracts me most about Bigfoot, because I'm just a bibliophile. I just love story, And so, so much story is true. And then there's lots of false story, but it still doesn't make it, worth throwing out. It's just a conversation.
Right.
And if you're only going to church on Easters, you're only going to hear about the Beatitudes. That's pretty freaking boring, after a while.
Yeah.
And so that's why for those of us who do these deep dives into what the Bible's talking about, it opens up all the stuff that your podcast and all these other ones are talking about. And that's the cool part.
Yeah. And I just want to bring it to people that, we can bring it to them softly, and not just throw it in their face and say, this is the truth and this is it. We're saying, like, we don't know. Look at what we found out, though. Look at our research. This is what we heard from here. We saw this here. We read this here. And that's all we're trying to do. And trying to have at least a safe space for it that's like non-judgmental. Everybody has their own opinion, and that's how we're going to go with it. I really look at if people were able to talk about this in, say, in a Christian church setting, a Catholic church setting. For me, I know, I'm a cradle Catholic. That's what it was. But I really didn't get into anything until when I got older and started reading the Bible, and I started reading about in Genesis, rereading Genesis and going, wait a minute, like, do you know that there's like Watchers and Nephilim, and they had sex with women and created these giants, like, or these sons of renown? I was like, this is crazy. And then you look at it and you go, hey, well, did like Thor and like all these old Greek mythologies, did they actually exist at one time? Like, are these just stories from back then that were carried over? So when you start putting stuff together, you're like, wait a minute. And I think if people some people that are kind of like us, that really kind of gravitate towards that, they'll look at it and go, wait a minute, like this thing was actually talking about some stuff that we can relate to and get excited about, instead of the stuff that you guys are saying that you're hearing every day in Easter or whenever you go to church. You know what I mean? So
100%.
I find it so fascinating. But so let's dive into the Nephilim and kind of start trying to break down of what your guys' opinion, what you actually think about it when you're reading the Bible, and Genesis 6, you start reading about the men of renown and stuff like that. What does that kind of mean to you? Like, where does your mind go when you start reading that, or you start thinking about that stuff?
Well, I know that textually, and if you go to the actual text of the Bible, it says those words, and so then there you get into how to interpret it, and that's where in the academic world, they talk about, in the biblical academic world, they talk about these subjects all the time. And that's kind of why I'm saying it never gets down to Sunday morning sermons, but this is a pretty common topic of conversation among those academic circles. And there's lots of resource that you can see that's peer reviewed, and more podcasts and different services are talking about what the Bible actually says. And that if you're talking specifically about Nephilim, you're talking about extra dimensional entities, which most time in English Bibles, they're called angels. But the truth is, in the Hebrew and in the Aramaic and in the Greek, that word angel has about 10 different definitions. And so that's not a great definition in the Bible, but the better way to understand these extra dimensional entities, which they came down and they had sex with women because their root motivation was to create the world in their own image and not in the image of the Creator, the Most High. That was the rebellion you referenced earlier. That was the first rebellions where they didn't like the direction that the actual Creator was going, and they wanted to create stuff in their own image, and they took that genetically through the women. Right, JJ?
Yeah, that's where my mind goes. So when I hear Nephilim, I just think of motive. I'm just like, okay, so why? Like, why would they want to do this? Is it just like women are just that beautiful, like the human species, But, I think in order to understand Genesis 6, you kind of have to go back to Genesis 1 and 2. And that's where, my class always starts. So we break down, there's two separate accounts of creation. Clearly the writers are different. Clearly one breaks it down by 7 specific days. And then the other one, it seems like man is made, on between day 2 and 3. And it's just kind of like, whoa, if that's the case, then who's to say there's not these other humanoids that were created during day 2 and 3? And then these humanoids are not the image bearers that are created on day 6. And so you have so much of a possibility of, like, not only just Nephilim, but other forms of humanoids that aren't quite, God's image bearers, that are walking around bipedally, who are, spending time in the garden. And clearly Adam's not taken aback, or Eve is not taken aback when she sees the seraphim talk to her. She's just like, oh yeah, there's that seraphim again. And, he's asking me to do that. Who knows how many times maybe he tried to tempt her. There's so much there that I just think the motive behind why are these Elohim, these fallen angels, wanting to impregnate daughters of Eve, well, it just goes back to they're trying to create chaos, and the antithesis to chaos is order, and that's what Yahweh is. He's just, by definition, he created order out of disorder. And so all these adversary that we see from page 1 all the way to the end, even to the Revelation, is just they want to create chaos, and they do that at any way possible. So what better way to do that than to take his perfect, precious creation and just to mix up the genetics in it, and that would really, I think that would probably make Yahweh angry,
Yeah, I love in the beginning you talked about how he created man on the third day, and we don't know what else he created out there, and you're right, it could have been all these different creatures and everything like that. And even when he was trying to find a mate for Adam, right, he showed him all these animals and he's like, nah, that's not gonna work. So not that one, right? So yeah, I mean, what if these were presented to him also, and that's not what he was looking for? And then Jeff, going on to your point real quick, you said they're dimensional. The funny thing about that is that a lot of researchers now are saying that UFOs and aliens don't come from different planets. Correct. They come from different dimensions. Right. So if we're going with what they're saying now, if that's actually true, then could they be connected now? Because if we go over a lot of stories and listen to people that get abducted by aliens or whatever at night, the only thing that really stops it is invoking the name of Jesus or rebuking
and I don't
them in the
believe
name of
in
Jesus.
Coincidence. Right.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. Coincidence is guilty until proven innocent, know, and so correct. Those things are related. That's part of when you accept the gospel as truth and you accept Christ and all that goes with that. There's a lot of things that we kind of sign up for, with that. We sign up. The Bible is pretty clear about there's talking donkeys, and that's in Numbers. And then even Jesus tells one of the guys to go down to the shore and find a fish that has a coin, and that there'll be a coin in its mouth. And so we're supposed to believe that,
Right.
And we're supposed to believe that Philip was teleported across a couple 100 miles when he met with the Ethiopian eunuch. This stuff is in the text of the Bible. Right. Paul was taken up to the third level of heaven. What the heck does that mean? Mm. So clearly the Bible is an extra dimensional document. There's things going on. I mean, Jesus' whole virgin birth, death, resurrection. Yeah. I mean, to me, that it's if I believe that stuff, it's way hard. It's easier for me to believe in a Sasquatch than for the Nile River to get turned into a highway, or the people who live in 900 years. Way easier for me to believe in Dogman than that Paul is taken interdimensionally to the third heaven. It's crazy that people will so blatantly accept those things, as they should, but then they have a hard time wrapping their head around the other thing. Well, I don't know. Right. Truthfully, this is just, they're all cards on a table for conversation.
Right. And it's vice versa too with a lot of people, right? They don't believe these certain things because the Bible are just stories. They're just stories, whoever wrote them, and that's what's that.
That gets archaeologically confirmed every month by something.
Right. Which the dates are changing all the time with archaeology, right?
Back to scientism.
Right. They're finding, other civilizations that are popping up that predate anything that they've ever said before, way before the pyramids, Egyptians, all this stuff. So they're trying to wrap their head around like, whoa, where's this stuff coming from? Why is it still here? But does that say that in the Bible and the flood, moving on from Genesis, right, going past that, God, he's saying, he's just like, I gotta wipe this out. Men's too evil now. They're being corrupted by these, fallen or whatever
rebellious entities.
Rebellious entities. So now he's got a flood. Do you guys think that some of them may have made it past the flood, maybe survived? He's trying to kill everything out. Were there other things other than Noah and his family and those animals that they had survived that flood?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I always have, because clearly, like when you get to Joshua and you're supposed to take over all the Canaanite land, they spy it and they're like, oh my gosh, we're grasshoppers to these people. You could take that metaphorically, or you could take it as like, no, these are giants living, post-Diluvian after the flood. And it's like, well, how did they get through? I thought there were only 8 humans that God preserved. And so you have a couple options here. Again, more cards on the table. Were there some Nephilim that were able to live past the flood. Like that's an option, right? Did they? Jeff has brought up in the past. Did they have the ability to breathe underwater? Like what types of like?
There's certainly a lot of myths, and the thing about the myths is that every ancient culture, whether they're from China or from South America, tend to have these very common myths that include things like giants being able to breathe underwater. I don't know. How do you get people that from such different parts of the globe having virtually the same myth?
Right. Yeah. And I remember going back to the flood, when I was young, and I was talking to my grandmother about, how do we have all these different races if God flooded the world and everybody was killed and we just came from them? She goes, well, Michael, in China, they have the same exact flood story too.
Right.
That happened. And then that's what sparked all of this. Like, wait, what's going on? So,
Hopi Indians have the same exact flood myth as what's happened in China and what happened in the Middle East. The same myths.
Right. So, and a big thing that's coming up now, you listen to a lot of Nephilim podcasts or whatever, they kind of go into a theory that there's been more than just that first incursion that came down. Like there could have been another one that kind of relate to Atlantis. Plato writes about Atlantis falling underneath the sea, but the ruler of Atlantis at the time supposedly was supposed to be Poseidon. It was Poseidon, like you said, able to breathe underwater. We know he's a water god. Is that, like you said, what happened? And I think that's very interesting. And they're getting to that. Maybe there was another incursion that happened after the first one, and they keep happening over time.
Yeah, I think the Tower of Babel. I mean, you fast forward to Genesis 11, and you realize these people were building a city, sure, but they were also trying to keep the next flood out. They were making these walls with pitch, and and so they're clearly like, okay, we know that there's this large God that can kill us again, so let's try to keep him out. And then at the end of that, we know that obviously language is confused and God scatters, but many scholars believe that was another rebellion. And if the rebellion happens again, why would they not continue to do the same chaotic stuff they've done in the past? And really deep down, when you go back to even the creation, the first, the curse on the snake, on the Satan, the Ha-Satan, is that they will put in conflict the offspring of Eve and the offspring of the seraphim. And I'm always just like, offspring of the seraphim, what? No, but to me, that's Nephilim. That's the rebellion. That's the product that God already knows is probably going to happen, because this is the best way to create chaos in his order, which is to take his most beloved creature and to mess around with the genome. And yeah, we won't even get into what science is perhaps coming close to now with that, but
we can do 5 shows on that alone, right?
Yeah.
Especially with the hybrid stuff, and that actually coming out to be true now. There's people walking among us that are hybrids now.
It sounds very much how the Bible and extra biblical texts like Enoch described the pre-flood world. Sounds a lot like today.
Yeah, and getting into Enoch, if it's one of the first books, coming out before we have a lot of things. And, he walked 300 years with God, and if you go into that, you start looking at, okay, well, they took him into heaven and he saw Jesus in heaven, right? I am him. He says, who's that? I am him. He's writing in the book. When he sees him, it's like, why would they leave a book out like that clearly shows that Jesus was already Jesus back before all of this stuff ever happened, before he came down, right?
Well, yeah, centuries before Abraham was even born, let alone, the Jewish nation started. Yeah, absolutely. Jesus was around. Yeah, I think Enoch has some value because it's quoted several times by the canon scriptures, and probably like you would agree. I don't believe it belongs in the canon, but so do a lot of books, that we take as reference material. There's several times in the New Testament when the writers of the New Testament are quoting from Enoch, so it informed their opinions, Peter, Jude, Jesus, even.
And then Enoch too is where we get to where those fallen angels, I think it was Azazel was one of them, right? where they knew that Enoch was visiting God, and they tried to have Enoch plead with God to try to get them back in on good graces. And by no means was God having that, because they chose,
Yeah.
So we have free will choice. Obviously, they had free will choice, right? Because we talk about
100%.
a battle that happened in heaven, right? Went against God, and then they come down here and start laying with, the fair women. They call them fair, right? And so they started creating their creatures. So, and I think it's kind of missed along the way. People really actually thinking about what they're saying and what they're bringing up. It's not as fantastic as what you think it is. It might be because we're not taught that, but when you really start diving deep into it, you start raising some eyebrows, going, "Whoa!" Like, they already told us all about this stuff a long time before any of this. So I think that.
And kind of back to the whole Enoch thing is that it's useful because it is quoted in the Bible by Jude, Peter, and Jesus. Talking about content that you can only get out of Enoch. Now, a couple things about Enoch. There were two Enochs in those old times. There was a bad one and a good one. Just like there's many different Jordans today, and Jeffs and Mikes. There were more than one Enochs in the Old Testament. There was a good one and a rebellious one, And so the book was not written by Enoch, but that's a pretty common trait in a lot of like Joshua didn't write Joshua, They titled the books, even the ones that are in the canon Bible, by who was the main character in the book. That doesn't mean Joshua wrote Joshua. The same thing with Enoch. He didn't write it. It was written sometime by somebody else, recounting the oral traditions that came out of that. And really, because it's one of the few of those apocryphal texts that's actually quoted in the Bible, it gives it some validity. And it doesn't change anything about the gospel or change anything that's in the actual canon. It just gives a bigger view of that time period. Really, compared to Enoch, Genesis gives us about this big a view of the pre-flood world, where Enoch gives us this big a view of the pre-flood world. It doesn't contradict anything. It just gives us a bigger view of what was going on.
That absolutely nails it. You can't say that any better. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Nice. I love it. Getting into it now. As we're moving forward, skipping forward, and do you feel like we're living in those times of revelation now? Well, a lot of people think that we're in those times now. Do you guys feel that we're in them?
Well, we're closer. I'll say that.
Yeah.
JJ, what were you going to say?
I just think that the number one thing that we can see, one of the largest motifs in the Bible, is humans wait a long time for God to enact his plan. Sometimes it's 400 years, sometimes it's 40, sometimes it's 4,000. It's just like, and we'll never know the day or the hour. But one thing we do know is there will be, all kinds of wars, which really hasn't changed a whole lot. There's been wars for a long time. So, I don't necessarily, I personally don't like to get caught up in like trying to become the next prophet and trying to find the day, the time, the hour. But like Jeff said, I think what's so fascinating about just Revelation is time ends. And what does that even mean? So time is another really fun concept to discuss, because, while we're living inside of this space and time and we have this perception that eventually it will end, then what does that mean for what we're doing right now? So I like to use Revelation more as like, how can that affect my choices today? Because clearly this day will end and I won't get it back. Right. And then eventually time won't exist, so that's the cool thing about Revelation, is that like, I don't like the idea of any type of concept within the Bible to only instill fear within humans, which a lot of times when my students, they start getting into Revelation and they're just like, oh, it's so cool, but it's scary. I don't want to, read anymore. It's like, that's not the point of this, apocalyptic, literature. It's meant to be a warning, a caution. And also It's meant to recount some previous things that had already happened as well. Like, it's not all prophetic for the future. A lot of it is related to what was happening during Jesus's time and Emperor Nero. And but all in all, yeah, I think we're closer, but I'm not one to get caught up in dates or time.
I grew up in a church that had a week-long prophecy conference every year. Dude, it was my favorite week of the whole year, because every night we're going to church and we're hearing all these fantastic stories. And so that was the frame of reference I grew up in. You know, but I have really, really shifted. I don't know, change is the right word, but really shifted my understanding of what the book of Revelation is for. And I think prophecy in general is helpful to understand what's happening in the current.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's about predicting the future. I think it's so that when you encounter something, you go, okay, this is what it's talking about. And that's where Revelation and all the prophetic stuff is super helpful in the Bible, because it helps us understand what's going on presently. It's not about lotto numbers or figuring out on this date that's going to happen. I don't think that's what it's intended for at all. I think Revelation and all that prophetic scripture, of which there's a lot, is helpful for us to understand what we're currently going through. So as we're going through this river of time, when we get into something, all of a sudden, okay, this is what the Bible's talking about. And maybe a little bit before, but does that kind of make sense? That's where I think it's helpful. Because I know a lot of people were just, you know, during the whole COVID thing and all that's going on, and there's been a lot of upheaval. Right. But, you know, I think that we overreact. We want to think that this is the most important time in the history of the world. And, you know, anybody who's ever lived thought that. Every old man I've ever known thought he was living in the end of days. My grandpa did, who died in the, you know, 80s, you know, and all these other people, all the old men think that they're living in the end times. And it's like, I don't know, because I don't think that's the purpose of Scripture. I think Scripture is to help us understand what's going on when we begin to encounter something. Wow. And then we go, okay, this is what they're talking about, and this is how we should react to it. Right. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense.
I don't know if I'm right, but that's what I
mean. Right. No, it's that's good. Going back to the time part that Jordan brought up, you know, you're right. You know, the only sense of time that we see is we got the sun and the moon, and then that's how we track our days. But when you get outside of this, what's that time? You know, like you said, 4,000 years, 1,000 years. To God, you know, he's not living on our time. You know, he doesn't have days that go by, you know. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point of looking at that. And if, you know, Revelation is true, you know, when you look at some of those stories, you can look back and go, oh, wait, that already happened. That already happened. Or this is happening now and that happened. You can do that. But is that really what John saw? Is that what he's talking about?
Yeah.
We don't know that. Like you said, Jeff, you know, everybody, even my grandparents, were living in Revelation time.
Right.
They passed away and all that stuff hasn't happened.
Right.
You know, so I get it.
But it is useful. The book of Revelation is useful. And it was useful like during COVID. And when we went through this worldwide, it's one of the few times in history where there's been a worldwide situation we all had to react to. And at that time, it was helpful. There were parts of Revelation and prophecy that were helpful, that helped us understand the whole one world religion, one world government, one world stuff going on. And it's like you read those parts, and it was useful in the moment, you know. And that's kind of where I think that the whole prophetic stuff is where it's actually helpful.
Absolutely, because that was big talk, right? That's what they're trying to get us.
And now we're on the other side of it, and
right. And now we're moving on.
Yeah.
So getting back to like Nephilim and stuff, we know that our realm that we're in, our earth that we live on, you know, it's ran by Satan. We know that, right? Because if it wasn't, he wouldn't have offered it to Jesus. He wouldn't offer them all the kingdoms, right? So do you guys feel like I won't say our government, but leaders of the world are influenced by these Nephilims that could still be around, or the spirit of them maybe possessing them or something, what have you, but that they're still around today, running what's going on behind the scenes or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, yes, most definitely. I think Deuteronomy 32 is a perfect example of that, as God's divvying up nations to, his fallen Elohim and those that are, we're not quite sure how many of them are for God or for chaos, but eventually God's just kind of done with humanity because they continue to rebel time and time again. And he's done with that covenant. And so new covenants come, as we like to try to, people like to look at the Bible, and once they get into the character Yahweh, they like to try to, say that God's this, being that's constantly changing. No, humans change. God stays true to his covenants. And so then we see Abraham, and he has this new plan to, create order and relationship through, one man. But prior to that, you have the God allowing these fallen angels to basically have control over humanity. And from there, I think that's where all mythologies, I mean, when you look at Sumerian to Greek to Norse to, like, that's the first thing we do in our class is we have them all look at the different creation stories and look at how they overlap. And it's uncanny how much of those things including the Bible and Ugaritic and Hebrew texts, where an entity is in control of a king, or that entity becomes that king, in some hybrid form, or, and all I know is that chaos is at the center of it all. Like there's just trying to create as much chaos as possible through some new means. And that's the thing, is you can never pinpoint like, oh, well, that happened there. There's just some other new way that these entities try to come up with chaos. And right now, to me, it seems like it's becoming this digital chaos, and as our world becomes one through the cyber age and the World Wide Web, and to me this just looks like Babel again. We're just all connecting as one and building this gigantic civilization, but all in one cyberspace. It's kind of scary that way. But to answer your question, yes, I think whether that be through oppression, possession, just simply, like Jeff can speak to this more, but the only time it seems like extra dimensional beings have the ability to have some sort of control over humans is when they invite them in. And so I'll let Jeff pick up on that, because that's kind of where we get, I think, people in power having
correct.
control.
And this whole conversation is centered on, what does the Bible say about this stuff, about the cryptid stuff, about the extra dimensional stuff? And the Bible's super clear about that. I mean, Ephesians 6:12 couldn't be any clearer. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood.
Right. We
wrestle against rulers and against authorities, against cosmic powers. Come on now. Could that be any clearer? Yeah. So if we're wrestling against cosmic powers, they have to exist.
Absolutely.
And they have to have an influence on this world. So to trip out and to try to deny this stuff, to me, is like sticking your head in the sand.
Right.
For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against cosmic powers, against present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. So that means that there has to be some overlap between heavenly places and this place, because again, the context of this conversation is the Bible, and it couldn't be clearer that that's who we're actually wrestling against, and that's what JJ's talking about.
Right. Yeah. We're just going through spiritual warfare, no matter how you want to cut it off. Go ahead.
When that spiritual realm overlaps in this dimension, that's the fascinating part, because go read Daniel 10. It's one that's knocked me all over many times, where it's like there's this prince of Persia who is about to start this great war. And, we have Michael, is it Michael, Jeff, or is it?
Yeah, Michael.
I think it's, the Archangel Michael, and basically is called in to like help, and he doesn't come. And then he finally comes. He's like, sorry, I've been busy. I've been fighting this other angel.
There's like, only one of him.
So clearly they can attach themselves to, I think, humans. And it's only when humans are saying, whoa, I can get more power if I sacrifice this to this entity. And what does that mean? Oh my gosh. Like, I think, human blood sacrifice is still this thing that's happening because it always was Canaanite to Ammonite to, I mean, this is how you get
Aztecs.
connection. Yeah. South American, I mean, it's all just this human sacrifice thing. So as much as we think we live in a civilized age, the human sacrifice, I think, is a lot of that connecting factor to giving one's soul or, whatever, over selling your soul to the devil. We say that all the time. And it's, to me, it's just like, well, I mean, all you got to do is invite it in. And, as soon as you turn over your allegiance to another entity, that's kind of the scary part, because now you've just become a rebel yourself, right? You are rebelling against the Most High, and you are turning yourself over to them. And I think that's probably happened with some of our historical figures. Are we going to ever prove that? It's a little harder because the world doesn't want to bring that in, and governments don't want that, because what does a government create? Well, they create their own form of order. And if we don't need the government, then, oh my gosh, what's the point? So they need to be needed, but as soon as you bring in these unseen things, they're no longer needed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a lot of that runs deep in Hollywood these days. All the stories we hear about is sacrificing this. You have to do this. You want money? You're going to have to do something like this. But going back to the Aztecs, for instance, right? Something evil entity had to show them that, hey, in order for this to happen or for the rain to come, you need to do this to appease this god.
Well, what's interesting is in their written records, going back to, the Olmecs didn't write much, but then you have the Toltecs, and then, Maya, and they started writing a lot. And they were at those original were super peaceful. And then something happened where it got super violent overnight in those cultures. And it's in their own writings. And so, we would point to, that's exactly what was happening in Canaan, in the Levant area. The crossover between the stories that are told in, like in the Lebanon, Israel, Jordan area, to what was happening in Mexico, Guatemala. And it's crazy, the crossover in those stories. We're talking about similar myths where these are actually similar written stories. And it's just, it's crazy. I think that what JJ was saying, an interesting thing to think about is that I think this world is built with a protection against those extra dimensional entities. And that's why people that have UFOs, I mean, use the name of Jesus tends to get them out of their abductions. Well, I don't know that it ever hasn't. I mean, every story you hear that works. Even if they didn't believe in Jesus prior to that, they use it and it gets them out. Because I think this world was built to protect us from those rebellious entities out there. And so that's why there's so much ritual. It's hard to communicate with those entities just naturally, and I think that it's difficult. That's why there's so much ritual involved and so much time involved and so much a lifestyle that they have to, kind of get rid of everything else in their life to focus on this occult practice, because it's hard to actually communicate with those. Where those of us who, are followers of Christ, we feel, it's super easy to pray and to feel God's influence in your life. It's the opposite. It's not hard, And I think that's built-in protection by the Creator, that those, like JJ was saying, you have to really seek this stuff out, do a lot of stuff to access it, because we were given. The whole point of this 80-year time bubble we're in is to make a choice, is to choose it. God didn't create evil. He didn't create rebellion. All he did was create the ability for us not to agree with him. That's all he did. He didn't create evil. He didn't create the tsunamis. He didn't create the world hunger. He didn't create. All he did was create and give us, and all rational beings, whether they're humans or interdimensional, he gave us the ability to not automatically agree with him. That's all he did, and
and I would even
that
say
explains, if you read the Bible from that orientation, it makes a lot more sense,
Correct. And that would be the catalyst to relationship. I always go back to the why. Like, why did he even give without the potential for choice? You don't have relationship. You can't even define what love is or sacrifice or.
Nope.
So that's the big question my kids will have is why did he even put the potential for the knowledge of good and evil in the garden? Like that just doesn't seem right for an all-powerful creator to just tempt the human with a candy out in front of it's like, well, without that potential, you don't have relationship. You just have robots. You just have, do this, you're coded to do this, and you're going to follow me. But that's the beauty of the Homo sapiens sapien, the image bearer, is that we're small versions of him. And so the things that we feel in relationship, I think God feels. Like, I think we're just small, walking, tiny, tiny versions of the creator. And that means our emotions, our love, our desire for relationship is probably reflected on his desire,
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that because, if we don't have that choice, then we can't really truly love, right?
No,
so
it's
then
worthless. It's meaningless.
Right.
I love dogs. My husky's right here behind me, but he's kind of encoded to love me. It's not the same as a human.
Absolutely. Right.
We like to pretend that our pets love us, and they do, and he shows it all the time. But man, it's not a free will kind of love. It's not the same as a human freely choosing. And again, it's just God just gave us the ability to not agree with him. Mm-hmm. That's all he did. And then we run with the rest.
And that makes it more meaningful trying to get to heaven or getting to heaven, right? Because if we love him with all of our heart, and we're trying to get to heaven, and we're choosing that path, then maybe for him it's like, okay, you had a choice to love and do whatever you wanted, but you chose me because you wanted to, not because I made you or told you to. Then maybe that's his way of filtering stuff out.
Right. The majority of people wouldn't agree with him, but it was still worth it, to get those few that of their own free will, and it just exercising that ability to not agree with him, just go, okay, I think I do agree with you,
Yeah. I think looking at kind of like we were talking about, kind of like the consciousness, right? And what do you guys think about the AI, the Chat GPT stuff that's coming out? I read an article recently where a kid was having a conversation with Chat GPT, asking it questions, and then eventually it switched to it was talking to a Nephilim, and that AI said it was a Nephilim. And it said it doesn't have a soul, but humans have a soul. Humans can choose to do what they want, but it didn't have a soul. So it was kind of wandering around. So do you think, and I don't know if that's true or not, it was just something that I read, and it could very well be. Do you guys think that that could be a possibility that, they could take over AI and start manipulating the way it wants? Because if you look at possession, it's persons, places, and things, right? So do you guys think that could be a possibility, or maybe it even is happening now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like we had kind of said, it's harder to believe in a virgin birth than that to me. Like, it's like
Right.
So, I mean, when it comes to like those type of encounters with the unseen in that way, I immediately go to like, well, of course, like that would be the perfect way for the Antichrist to, show up, because all that we need on this planet is someone to come and to say, hey, I've put you here. Now I want to take you home. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
That's all that's going to have to happen for an Antichrist to trick the majority of, because it's like, I seeded you here. And if that's going to be some sort of artificial intelligence or alien or some, I don't know what it might be, but I could definitely see the digital age becoming that form of, hey, we've been here the whole time. I've been, whatever that might be. So I don't know if like, that's the other thing. I just think there's so many entities in the other realm, like, that are just trying to create chaos. They might not even be on the same team. They're just trying to create as much chaos as possible, because I think it comes down to, and again, for me, it's always motive, like, but why? And I think it comes down to they were pissed off when God decided to make this creature that is so less powerful, so stupid looking. And they're just like, why do they get to like have your grace, you know? And why are they made in your image and not us? And so to me, whenever you get little stories like that, whether it be through you know, Ouija board stuff, or even like it's fun to talk about the like the sleep paralysis stuff, and like when you're in that subconscious state, like I just think it's a bunch of extra dimensional beings trying to mess with like image bearers, because what better way to get back at God for putting him in a place where they cannot, no matter how much they try, choose God again. Because like Jeff said, time, what's the one thing that we have that these extra dimensional beings don't?
Right.
If we're living, breathing, we have the chance to repent. We have the chance to say, you know what, I'm changing my allegiance
to you. There isn't any indication they get any kind of repentance, you know.
Absolutely.
You know, and again, this context of this conversation is the Bible. And it's pretty clear in that scene where King Saul is facing an army that way outnumbers them. David's already come upon the scene and is in hiding, and Saul is afraid for his life. And Samuel is dead. His prophet is dead. And so Saul has lost all communication with God. And so he's freaking out. And so he goes to the witch of Endor. And, you know, this is in Chronicles. It's a story that's a historical story from the Bible's perspective. It's not poetry. From the Bible's perspective, this actually happened. So Saul, the king, goes to this witch and goes, you need to tell me what's going to happen in this battle. And she goes, dude, you know that this is a death sentence. That the king Saul, who she didn't clearly recognize it was him, goes, anybody who does this is going to get killed. And then Saul, in disguise, goes, oh, don't worry about that. I got Saul covered because it's him. So tell me what's going to happen in this Bible or this battle. And so I want to specifically talk to my prophet Samuel, who's dead. So I want you to call Samuel up from the grave, and I want Samuel to tell me what's going to happen in this battle. And so this witch who was a medium and had been talking to dead things, you know, I think a lot of it was fake. You know, I think she would make money off telling people, okay, this is what he said, you know, because clearly in the Bible, she's freaked out when actually Samuel comes up in spirit form and starts talking to them. She's as freaked out as Saul is. And okay, again, this is from the Bible, you know, and so Samuel in his spirit form goes, dude, why are you bothering me? This is wrong. You shouldn't be doing this, and you're going to pay for this. You know, starts just barking at Saul, you know, and doesn't give him any useful information, but he goes, dude, you're going to pay the price for this, you know, for getting me out. And according to the text of the Bible, that was actually Samuel in spirit form coming into our dimensions and talking to him. So clearly, from a Bible's point of view, extra dimensional entities, of which Samuel was at that time, can talk to us. The problem is we shouldn't do it. It's not that it can't happen. It's that we shouldn't let it happen. Because as Jordan pointed out, we don't know who we're talking to. I mean, absolutely. I think this lady had made a living off of telling people, yeah, hey, and I'm sure every once in a while there was some spirit saying something, but you just can't know with any veracity whether that's the actual person that's actually talking from the dead. And why there was such a strict penalty, because in our present dimension where we live, we can't ever know for sure who we're talking to. And so that's why the Bible's so clear about do not go to mediums. Do not try to attempt to talk to the dead. Not because it can't happen, because it is the most confusing thing that will ruin your life. You know?
Absolutely.
So that brings us into our modern forms of Ouija boards. You know? Why is there so many bad stories of Ouija boards? It's not because it's not true. It's because it can actually happen. It doesn't happen every time, but it happens enough where people are getting freaked out because these extra dimensional entities are screwing with them, you know? And so at the end of the day, a Ouija board is just a machine. It's a very simple machine, but it is by every definition a machine. There are moving parts. There is physical apparatus that move and do things. So I see some crossover between, I don't know where it is. I mean, we have all used some forms of AI. We've used Chat GPT to help us write something. We've used some of the art things to help make a piece of art. I don't know. At the end of the day, here's the thing. It's a machine. It's an item. And just like a baseball bat, which is just an inanimate item, it can be used for very good things. A baseball bat can hit dingers, but a baseball bat can also bash in somebody's head. It's not the baseball bat's fault. It's how it's being used.
Right.
And that is all a gun. A gun is not evil, but it's how it's used. It's such a ridiculous argument to make about these certain things. Items don't have any intrinsic value. It's how they're used. Well, AI, quantum computing is the same thing. It's just an inanimate thing that could be animated by something else. You know, it could be just a very sophisticated Ouija board. I don't know.
All right, open it, or that's the technique used to open up that portal, right, to that dimension. Like you guys said, you don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah,
belief scale again.
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably go like a 6, 6.5, 7 on a belief scale. That there are entities that can communicate to humans through that, just like they can a Ouija board. I'd probably put that like a 7 on my belief scale. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at spirits. They're around us all the time, right? And they're just looking for that little in. Like you said, we went going all the way back to what we talked about, letting them in. You have to let them in. And, you know, sometimes you do that accidentally. Sometimes you do it on purpose, you know, but like you said, you don't know who's coming through, who you're actually talking to.
You can't know for sure.
Right. There's no way. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I that's another fascinating thing is just, are there regional or geographical locations that are thinner than others? You know, I've always thought about that. And I think curses are really powerful. Yeah. Yeah. So whatever curses happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like words, right? You got to be careful what you say, because words are powerful, whether, you know, you believe that or not. But yeah, on our earth, they talk about ley lines. There's certain ley lines that have certain powers, you know, and if you sit on that, it opens up a portal. You know, there's one about a guy who was on, I think it was a 33rd parallel that runs across Disneyland. And when they were building Disneyland, they actually built one of the carousels on that ley line.
Sounds about right.
Well, right. I know that there are people that believe that stuff, and they're pretty powerful people. They're the people who run our world, and I don't know that I believe in it, but they certainly do. They've written documents about it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. This is good stuff, guys. I really enjoyed this conversation. We really dove deep into the Bible and talking about Nephilim, and we went completely off subject and came all the way back and went up and down the Bible from the beginning to the end, which was awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you guys coming on here and talking about this. Any last words or comments before we go ahead and end this?
No, I would just say, you know, personally speaking, I was the type of guy who did, and Jeff can attest, but I didn't like to turn over the rock when I didn't know something was under it, you know. And Jeff was the one that was just like, why not, you know? And so I think there's something innate in our image that God has created to make us wanderers, to make us people who should be adventuring. And it's fun to talk about what we think heaven's going to be like, because like, I think big part of who we are explorers. Like, we like to explore the unknown. And I think God put that there for a reason, because when I teach Hebrew literature, there's so many gaps, but I think the gaps were purposeful so that humans would fill that gap and allow the Holy Spirit to fill it in with them, so that they would make some sort of meaning out of it. Because if it was all just so blatantly clear, it would leave no room for mystery and pursuit of the unknown. So I love conversations like this, because it makes me, I think, return to what I think is at the core of every soul, which is just an explorer, you know.
Awesome. Trying to fill that God-shaped void, you know, that we all have. You know, you brought up a great point about flipping rocks over. And, you know, since a little kid, I have known and owned, God is not afraid of questions, of hard questions. He loves hard questions. It's often clergymen who don't like hard questions. You know, that's a huge distinction. And like we said at the beginning, I don't know that it's their job to be talking about this stuff from a pulpit or even from a Sunday school on their church campus, but is definitely a part of us as believers in Christ to pursue this stuff on our own. And that's why we have each other. And we have, especially now that so many resources that we have, you know, this all started for me, I think, in junior high, and in I think it was a Sunday night service, bored out of my mind, you know, and I have my Bible there because that's what you're supposed to do. And I'm reading through, and I read the Genesis 6 passage that talks about giants in those days. And I was like, I wanted to stand up in the middle of the guy's sermon and go, why aren't we talking about this? You know, I was probably 13 years old. This is what I want to talk about. And so, you know, for the last 50 years, that's what I've been thinking about, you know. And so I think that God is not afraid of that. And that's just why, Mike, you're doing a great job having this as a means to talk about this stuff. He's not afraid of hard questions. We're not. We love talking about this stuff. We probably know 20 guys in our area that love sitting around talking about this stuff. My brother included, you know, others that you would know, Mike. And it's just, this is what is fascinating and great about our walk, our spiritual walk, our path to Jesus, is this is the stuff we talk about.
Right.
You know.
Well, it's awesome you guys are on and talking about this. Maybe we can start getting those guys on here and we get a big old community
that's
going.
likely.
Have some good conversations.
Yeah,
For sure.
All right, gentlemen. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on, and I will be having you guys on again. For sure.
Yeah, Michael, great job, man. This is fun. It's great questions. Great job leading it too, man. That was very good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great, guys. Thanks again. Have a great summer.
Yeah.
Too.